Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is all right. So, today we are continuing our travel through the Elizabethan period. I'm not spending too much time introducing the subject, since you should have already studied it last year. So take this lesson as an in-depth revision of the most important aspects of the period. Yesterday, we looked at how the court worked and why it was important. In brief, it was because it was the center of a nationwide patronage network, which engulfed more or less all the aspects of social life in the period, and the place where certain important political decisions were taken. For example, who would become a favorite of the Queen, who would get a trade monopoly, who would lead an army, this sort of things. The court was not, however, an official branch of the government of the country. It was rather more similar to a club of influential people who tried to get in the good graces of the monarch in order to reap some benefits. The day-to-day administration of the country, that is the foreign policy, the collection and the redistribution of tax money, the religious policies. What do we mean with redistribution of tax money? You take money from some people and then give it to some other purpose. Mostly this sort of money, taxation in pre-industrial states, were used to finance armies. They didn't have the NHS, they didn't have welfare, so when we're talking about redistribution of tax money, we mean financing the army, essentially. Still, those daily tasks were essentially the responsibility of a number of other official bodies, the first and foremost of which was the Privy Council. The Privy Council will be the object of today's lesson, and we will look at the following points. First, how did the council work? Second, we'll look at the council as a mirror of the social development that were taking place in the country, looking at religion and then at social classes, at which people held power in the country. And then I will give you a model answer. This, of course, is in order to prepare you for answering the following exam question, which is explain what was important about the Privy Council. You will find some sources on William Cecil at the end of the transcript. You can also look at the notes of the Elizabethan period that I have uploaded and at the GCSE exam guide that I have also uploaded in the Google Classrooms. So, let's start by looking at how the Privy Council works. If you go to the notes on Elizabethan England or in the transcript, you will find a diagram describing how the government of the country worked at all levels. Now, as with most 16th century institutions, it was very complicated, hierarchical, and extremely confusing for our modern eyes. The main takeaway, the main point to remember, is that in this jungle of competing powers at all levels, church authorities, local judges, town councils, regional councils, and so on, the most important decisions at the national level were taken by the Privy Council, a group of private advisors to the monarch in this case being Queen Elizabeth. It did not have a fixed number of people, and unlike modern cabinets, it was not like one person takes care of a certain things. Everybody was the minister of everything in a way, had the say, could voice an opinion on anything. And yeah, it did not have a fixed number of people, but had as many members as the current monarch wished to have. For example, during the time of Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, remember her? We haven't discussed her, but you should remember her from last year. It was the queen, the Catholic queen that tried to make England Catholic again. So during the time of Queen Mary, the council was very large and had around 40 members. This was probably because Mary wanted to reduce the influence of the single members. If you have a large team of people, then the individual voices are less important. And also because she required a wide support from the upper classes for a project of making England Catholic again. But during the reign of Elizabeth, the number of advisors, of councillors, was reduced to around 15-20 members. For most of the time there were 19 of them. Generally, they were actually an uneven number, so that there could be no splits in the council. So if you have 20 members, you can get 10 and 10, but if you have 19, you have 10 and 9. The Queen, of course, had the last word in every matter, but decisions were often influenced by the suggestions and advice provided by the councillors. And the councillors themselves often took care of matters that the Queen could not or should not handle personally. A good example is what William Cecil did about Mary Queen of Scots. William Cecil was the key advisor, we will talk about him later, insisted that Mary Queen of Scots, and we will also talk about her in another lesson, insisted that Mary Queen of Scots should be beheaded in 1587 after the Babington plot. He convinced Elizabeth to sign her death warrant and eventually published the death warrant of Mary Queen of Scots and made it public to the entire reign of his own accord, because it would have been unfit for a queen to manage the killing of another queen and of one of her own relatives. So the things that the Queen could not touch and should not touch were generally handed over to the councillors. For this little thing of publishing the death sentence of Mary Queen of Scots, William Cecil did a week in prison, but everybody knew it was a sham, that everybody was agreeing, so it was just for a week and it was mostly for show. Now, the main job of the Privy Council was to advise the Queen in matters of religious policy, that is, how to deal with Puritans and Catholics, foreign policy, how to deal with other countries, mostly in this period Spain, France and the Netherlands. We'll look at the Netherlands when we will be doing the Spanish Armada. And domestic matters. Domestic means internal. Domestic comes from the Latin domus, meaning house, and it's the internal affairs of the country. So again, mostly how to spend tax money and how to deal with plotters and claimants and other internal problems of politics. The council also took care of daily business and petitions that were not deemed important enough to reach the Queen. So if you had a complaint that some guy stole your pig from your farm in Wessex, then you sent a petition to the Queen, but the Queen could, of course, not be bothered to think about your pig, so the Privy Council took care of it generally. That's just an example, of course. There were all sorts of layers of judgment you had to go before you could get an audience from the Queen or from the Privy Council. Nevertheless, don't worry, it's not the virus. There were three main requirements for being part of the Privy Council, and they tell us a lot about the time period. Okay, understanding which kind of people is allowed to hold positions of powers is generally a very good way of understanding how a society works. So, to get inside the council, one needed to be male. We're still in a patriarchal society, and if you remember from last year, Elizabeth had huge problems making her subject believe in her, even though she was a woman. Okay, being a queen was seen as an obstacle that she had to overcome in order to win the trust of a subject. Two, they needed to be members of the upper classes. Ordinary people like merchants, artisans, not even mentioning farmers, were generally not allowed in the Privy Council. If they were, it would have been a problem, because if you remember from your English lesson, think about the great chain of being. One of the key mental structures they had at the time was that everything had a hierarchy, okay? Plants had a hierarchy, animals had a hierarchy. There were better animals and worse animals. There were better plants and worse plants. And therefore, there were better people and worse people. How do you judge the quality of a person? From the class in which they were born, okay? If they're a member of the nobility, okay. If they're a member of the gentry, okay. If they're a member of the urban middle classes, not okay. There were also other reasons for that, and we will probably discuss them when studying social classes, but for now, just be aware that you needed to be a male member of the nobility or the gentry, so the upper classes, people who were rich and didn't need to work. And also you needed to be Protestant. The 16th century was a time of huge religious divisions, of huge religious fights, okay? Religion and politics could not be separated. You wanted to serve a Protestant queen? Generally, there might have been some exceptions. You needed to be Protestant. Which leads us to the next point, okay? Now we looked at how the council worked and who you needed to be in order to join the council. Now we're going to look at how the Privy Council was a mirror of the country and of its historical and societal developments. Let's look at religion first. The 16th century, as we just said, was a period obsessed with religion. Okay, this should not surprise us, since it was the time of the Protestant Reformation and the time where it was absolutely impossible to separate religion and politics. The entirety of Elizabeth's reign was predicated on the fact that she was the Protestant queen. Therefore, if the Council of Queen Mary, whose reign was built on the political project of turning England into a Catholic country again, so the entire political project of the monarch was built on the fact that she was Catholic and she would make the country Catholic after the Protestant reforms of Henry VIII and Edward VI. So the Council of Mary was full of Catholic nobles. On the other hand, the Privy Council of Queen Elizabeth, whose entire legitimacy as a ruler, okay, the fact that she was supposed to be the ruler of the country instead of someone else, all of her legitimacy depended on presenting herself as the true Protestant heir to Henry VIII. Therefore, her council was fully Protestant. However, while Elizabeth herself had sponsored the famous Elizabethan settlement, which was some sort of middle ground compromise between Catholic ritual and Protestant doctrine. I'm not sure we will be looking at this in our revision, but if you want to remember, there is this beautiful sentence that the Elizabethan settlement made the Church of England look Catholic but think Protestant. Okay, so it was a middle ground compromise that maintained some of the ritual of the Catholic Church, but the doctrine, the way of thinking, was fully Protestant. So, what was I saying? Ah, yes. While she was sponsoring this famous Elizabethan settlement, her council was not made of people who were full supporters of that compromise. Why? Because there was another important religious division, not just between Protestants and Catholics, but also between the Anglicans, that is, the supporters of the official Church of England, and the Puritans, who were radical Protestants who wanted to see the official structure of the church changed radically into a completely different direction, had different ideas about religion worked, and so on. It was a very important split that starts in the reign of Elizabeth. In this context of this division between Anglicans and Puritans, it is interesting to note that several of the council members of Elizabeth were indeed Puritans, including some very important names like Robert Dudley, who was her lover, allegedly, and Sir Francis Walsingham, who was a spy master and in charge of checking that people were not plotting to kill her. This shows that the country was still somewhat divided in terms of religion despite her compromise, a division that would become dramatically important in the 1640s during the English Civil War, where Anglicanism, High Church of England, and Puritanism started fighting an actual civil war. Of course, the English Civil War is much more complicated than that, but this division was one of the main causes. Now, let's move on to another important way in which the Privy Council mirrored society and mirrored the development of English society in the 16th century. That is, social classes. Religion was not the only large change at a societal level that became apparent in the Privy Council. There was also a shift in the class background of the councillors. As we said, you needed to come from the upper classes. But there were different kinds of upper classes. There was the nobility, people who had titles like Duke, Earl, Count, Baron, and so on, who generally had their own private armies called affinities, had military training, and were the old nobility, the nobility of the sword. And then there was the gentry. There were the new rich people, who didn't have any title but lived like nobles. So some of the most important councillors were members of the landed gentry. That is, they were very wealthy people who lived like but did not have the titles, the military training, or the private armies that characterized the sword nobility. There were several reasons for the emergence of the gentry as an important class in the Elizabethan periods, which we will see next weeks. But today we're looking at the presence in the Privy Council, which is, I think, quite significant because on the one hand, it shows that the social class of the new nobles without a title was becoming more important, and on the other hand, that Elizabeth actually preferred them. So we see a new social class that started emerging, and we see a queen that actually prefers to employ them instead of employing the old nobility. The reasons for this preference are relatively easy to understand, I think. First of all, they were, as we said, a new form of upper class. They did not have the deep roots and the power base of the nobles. She could control them, and being a class of newcomers, the members of the gentry tended to work harder to prove their worth at court. Okay, without being the Earl of Cornwall, I don't know. If you did not have a title, if you were not the Earl of Cornwall or whatever, you needed to prove that you were worth something, that you were worth sitting in the council, and therefore you worked harder. Also, if you didn't have a title, if you didn't have armed people paid at your expenses who were loyal only to you rather than to the queen, as many nobles did, then you were less of a threat to the queen herself. The case of William Cecil is particularly instructive. He was the grey eminence of the realm, the power behind the throne, and the Queen's most trusted advisor. Not only he was extremely loyal in what he did, there is a nice source, which I'm reading right now, in the transcript, in which he professes his full loyalty to the Queen. He says, "I do hold, and always will, discourse in such matters as I differ in opinion from Her Majesty. As long as I may be allowed to give advice, I will not change my opinion, but as a servant I will obey Her Majesty's command, presuming that she, being God's chief minister here, it shall be God's will to have her commandments obeyed." So on the one hand, he was very loyal. On the other hand, as a Spanish ambassador reported, the Queen often told him that she had been strong enough to lift him out of the dirt, and she was able to cast him down again. She had the power to give to this newcomer a position of authority, but the same way she created them, she could cast them down again. In conclusion, there are several main reasons actually, why the Privy Council was an important subject of study. But let's only talk about these three. First, it was the main governing body of the country, where the most significant decisions were taken. Second, its internal developments mirrored the religious developments of the country, so there was a split between Puritans and Anglicans. Anglicans means Church of England, Puritan means radical Protestant. And three, it also mirrored other social changes, such as the rise of the gentry as an important social class. Now, I would like you to look at the sources and at the model answer and write your own answer to the question. As always, I am going to read the model answer. In the transcript, it's color-coded for your convenience according to the peel structure. So, model answer. The importance of the Privy Council can be summarized in 2 points. It was the main governing body of the country in the 16th century, and it shows historians how society changed during the Elizabethan period in terms of social class and religion. The government of Elizabethan England, as with all 16th century institutions, was a complicated affair. It was, with numerous different institutions taking decisions at many different levels. The most important of these decisions, however, were taken by the Privy Council. This restricted group of about 19 people advised the Queen in matters of religious policy, how to deal with the Catholics and the Puritans, foreign policy, how to deal with Spain, France and the Netherlands, and domestic policy, how to deal with plotters and pretenders such as Mary, Queen of Scots. While the Queen had the last word on everything, it was the Council which suggested her how to act. The members of the Council took decisions based on their own religious denomination or on their political views. It is therefore interesting to see how the political and religious beliefs of the members of the Elizabethan Council changed compared to the previous periods. In terms of religion, the obvious change from the time of Mary was the reliance on Protestant councillors rather than on Catholic ones. However, the change was more subtle, and there was also a number of Puritan councillors such as Robert Dudley or Francis Walsingham, suggesting a wider diffusion of radical Protestant thinking even within the inner circle of the Queen. Social class was also an important variable, and this is shown by the fact that Elizabeth preferred to employ members of the gentry rather than members of the old titled nobility, not just because of their skills, but also because they could be controlled more easily, since they lacked the military power basis that made the nobles a threat to the monarchy. A good example of this process is the career of William Cecil, who, besides being extremely competent at his job, was kept in his position because the Queen could control him and, in her own words, she could lift him out of the dirt and cast him down again. The rise of the gentry as a new and powerful social class was partly due to this royal favoritism and would have more important consequences in English history. Therefore, the Privy Council is an important object of study not only because it was the most significant governing body of Elizabethan England, but also because it was a mirror of how the country developed during the 16th century. Okay then, I'm looking forward to read your answers in the Google form, as always, and see you next time.